In the 19th century, Britain experienced an economic and social revolution. Part of this was a new form of public transport on the streets of Britain's towns and cities: trams. Initially powered by horses, steam tramcars then appeared in some areas, but it was the electric tram that really brought a major leap forward. Tram networks sprang up across the country to transport workers to and from their places of work and around holiday destinations. By the early 20th century, there were over 300 British tram networks carrying millions of passengers. Trams were reaching their heyday. With no money to invest after the First World War, the tired and worn-out tram networks were falling out of favour. Operators and passengers preferred the new motor buses. The tramways fell into decline and closures commenced. Decrepit infrastructure was often the reason given for closure. But also trams were simply no longer fashionable. And to add further to the trend, a Royal Commission declared tramways, if not obsolete, certainly obsolescent. In the 1930s, whilst a few tram operators bravely invested in streamlined trams and extended tramways, 40 or so sizable networks disappeared for good, including route closures in all the major cities. In response to trams being scrapped and tramways torn up, a group of passionate campaigners joined together in the 1930s to try to save remaining routes and visit closing networks. During the Second World War, trams played an important role in helping to keep the nation moving. But with the return of peace, the lack of investment, arrival of diesel buses, and growth in private car ownership conspired to sound the death knell for trams. Organised farewell tours resumed with greater frequency. One tour resulted in the purchase of the tram, which in turn led to the development of the National Tramway Museum. A century after the arrival of the tram in Britain, the first generation street tram, once the principal means of mass urban transport, finally reached the end of the line in 1962. But just 30 years later, street-running trams returned to Manchester. An urban transit system that fell from favour as fashions changed and technology improved, the tram is on the rise once more. The second generation of trams, which are bigger, faster, comfortable and far more efficient, are proving a popular solution for urban transportation in Britain's key towns and cities. Originating in Northern Europe, the word tram meant a beam or balk of wood, but its connection to transportation stems from the use of beams of timber to guide mining wagons.
They were laid on the soft earth to stop wagons from sinking into muddy fields. And so what you would have is a set of wooden rails, effectively, that became a tramway. We'd think of them as railways now, but the name hadn't been invented, and so they were called tramways.
The world's first passenger tramway, the Oystermouth Railway, opened on the 25th of March 1807. Although no part of the line was in the streets, a carriage with a driving position at either end was pulled by a horse.
It's basically a stagecoach on rails, and it looks very much more like a horse tram than it does a train. And so we'd like to claim that one back for tramways and say that it's the world's first passenger carrying railway was in fact a tramway.
Another quarter of a century was to pass before the first streetcar service began in America.
The evolution of the tram happened from people's fear of steam. Railways were around, but people just simply didn't like the steam engines, they were afraid of them. And in America they did actually pull railway carriages through the street, uncouple the engine and pull them through the street with horses, and someone had the bright idea that instead of having these huge great railway carriages, why don't we use smaller carriages to pull passengers?
Street tramcars were first introduced to the British Isles in 1860 when a permanent street tramway was constructed in Birkenhead by an American named George Francis Train.
He launched this thing with great flamboyance through a party, invited all the crowned heads of Europe. None of them came, and but he was like that, he did things like that. It was only quite a small line, it was only a mile or so long, but it provided a key link through the centre of the town and to the ferries.
But it wasn't very successful because he used a rail, which was not grooved rail that we're used to now, but was a step rail, which meant that it was above the road surface. And that meant that other road users found it really, really difficult. You know, the carts and things would run against the rail and they wouldn't be able to cross over it.
George Francis Train then introduced trams to London in 1861. And by 1862, he also had tramways in Darlington and the Potteries. But without any rules or regulations regarding the laying of tramways, Train had a free hand to do as he pleased, so he continued to lay American step rail. A mass of complaints rapidly followed. In Birkenhead and the Potteries, the step rail was replaced with a grooved rail that was sunk into the road surface, and the tramways survived. But in London, the lines were completely removed.
The passengers received George Francis Train's tram very well because it gave a smoother ride than the horse bus had. They were better ventilated, the vehicle had more space, and they received it very well.
George Francis Train was officially declared a public nuisance for digging up the roadway without authority.
But it started the process, and people started to think about building what the Americans called street railways.
In the early 1800s, the majority of Britain's population lived in the countryside. But as people migrated into the larger towns and cities to take up work in industry, urban areas became overcrowded. Trams, costing passengers just a penny a mile, were cheaper, safer, and more comfortable than horse buses, enabling the middle classes to move out to the suburbs. London's first tramways began in 1870, and within 5 years, 55 miles of line had been built for London's 350 horse trams. Suddenly, horse trams were in demand across the country. Cities and towns, large and small, wanted their own tram networks. By 1878, Britain's 300 miles of tramways were carrying 150 million passengers a year. The age of the horse tram had arrived.
The horse is terribly expensive. If you run a horse tramway, you have to have a huge stable of horses. If you have like 100 trams, you probably have to have 500 horses, because the horse will only work for so many hours a day. And so actually horse tramways, the fares on them were for the middle class. The working class couldn't afford to go on a horse tramway, really.
Tramcars at the time did not look much different to a horse bus with a platform and staircase at both ends. But a horse tram offered a much smoother ride, and thanks to the smooth iron rails, could also carry twice as many passengers as a horse bus. With holidays by the sea growing popular, seaside tramways developed. One of the earliest, located in Douglas on the Isle of Man, is still in operation and has remained relatively unchanged since it opened in 1876. Thomas Lightfoot, a retired civil engineer, had spotted the potential for public transport along the developing promenade. A single line which was later doubled and extended. Today, the 3-foot gauge Douglas horse tram has operated continually, except for a break for the duration of World War II. The high cost of running horse tramways led companies to explore alternative forms of power. Almost 3/4 of a century after Richard Trevithick's 1801 steam road locomotive, self-propelled tramcars were finally being contemplated.
To get through to the 1870s before you really start to get mechanical traction in the street, it is a long, long time.
Civil engineer John Grantham demonstrated an open-top, 4-wheel steam-powered tramcar in March 1873. Able to carry 60 passengers, his tramcar entered service in 1876. The 1874 Howard Medal was awarded posthumously to Grantham for inventing a locomotive to replace horse traction on street trams.
The 1870 Tramways Act meant that the local authorities could lay tramways down, they could get a tramway order and then lease them out to the individual operator. But it meant that you could get more stops per mile, you could carry people over a shorter distance than was often the case with the railways. And it meant that people could travel much more cheaply as well.
Up till then, if you wanted to build a tramway, if you called it a street railway, you had to get an individual Act of Parliament to do it, to authorise you to dig up the roads and so on.
But it was the 1879 Act for the Use of Mechanical Power on Tramways that enabled the wider use of steam trams and of raising speed limits to a heady 10 miles per hour. But even so, there was still a good many restrictions.
You couldn't see moving parts, and so this gave rise to the traditional square box that the steam tram became, because a skirt was put over the wheels down to 4 inches above the rail. That was taken up so that you couldn't see the firebox. Coke was used so it emitted no smoke, and the steam was condensed in condensers, usually on the roof. And so you ended up with this quite square sort of box-like engine, and then that was allowed in the street, and so that opened up the street for mechanical transport.
The first really significant operation was that of Huddersfield in 1885, and that's significant because it was also the first municipality to operate trams in the British Isles. Prior to that date, trams had always been operated under lease by private companies. Huddersfield tried to lease the tramways out, but unfortunately nobody was prepared to take the lease on, and the upshot was that the corporation operated its own tramways.
Lightly laid tram tracks, perfectly suited for horse trams, were initially unsuitable for carrying the weight of a heavy-bodied steam tram. But by the 1890s, 500 steam trams were in service on 50 tramways across the country. The remainder stuck with horses. Trials with other forms of traction continued.
People tried all sorts of crazy ideas. They had stored steam, where they would generate the steam in one place and then put it in cylinders within the tram in compressed steam form. There were gas trams, there were compressed air trams, a clockwork tram, a caustic soda tram, where you raise the temperature of the water up to nearly boiling point and then dump caustic soda into it. And there were all sorts of ideas that never really worked. The ones that did work were cable trams, where you obviously had a stationary steam engine which pulled a cable round.
Cable systems were mostly confined to lines with very steep gradients. There were also a number of unusual cable tramways.
The Snaefell mountain railway on the Isle of Man takes people from the Manx electric station at Laxey up Snaefell. So there were a number of tramways that were specifically designed as tourist attractions right from the start.
Built in 1895 under tramway regulations, but very much a railway, the 3.5-foot gauge electrified Snaefell mountain railway is based upon the Swiss Fell incline system.
The Fell system has a series of, if you like, cogs underneath the tram, which mesh with a third rail between the two running lines, and that is designed as a safety feature. In other words, the cogs engage, and it prevents the tram running back, except under controlled circumstances. So it's very much designed to facilitate tramways operating over a steeper gradient than would be permissible usually.
The last cable tramway to be constructed in the UK, although not a cable tramway in strict technological terms, is the Great Orme tramway in Llandudno, North Wales.
The Great Orme is an interesting combination of tramway and funicular. Now, funicular is generally associated with being a cliff railway, i.e. a very, very steep and short ascent and descent. Great Orme is actually technically a funicular because the two cars on each section are permanently fixed to the cable. As one descends, the other rises at exactly the same speed, and they have a passing place in the middle where the two pass both on the lower and the upper sections.
Constructed in 1902 to take Edwardian ladies and gentlemen to Britain's healthiest spot at the top of the Great Orme, Britain's only double reversible funicular tramway was built in 2 stages, the upper and lower sections each operating 2 cable-hauled cars.
On the lower section, it's operated by 2 cables that are just connected directly to the trams, and it's basically just an up and down. The lower section is sort of slightly different because that's on the roadway and everything's underground there. There are pulleys under the surface, under the concrete.
Halfway station is the centre of operations and houses the winding gear or winch drives. A second tramway, built in 1903, then carries passengers from Halfway Station to Summit Station at the top of the Great Orme.
The guys on the front of the trams are the eyes and ears for us, but it's actually the winchmen that are doing the driving.
Despite CCTV, the only signals for the winchmen to know when to speed up, slow down, cross points or stop at traffic lights come from the attendants on board the tramcars.
The tramcars are sort of slowed down and stopped by the winchmen using a series of yellow markers that are actually on the drum and on the rope. They know exactly whereabouts the tram is and how much rope there's left. Each winchman is slightly different. Some will sort of knock it off sooner, some of them will leave it right to the very end, knock the power off, and the last little bit will actually glide to a stop. And that's the art of it, being able to sort of do that.
Power distribution was just getting better and better. People did realise the potential of electricity, and what they were trying to do was just manage to get electricity into the vehicle.
The development of an improved dynamo by German scientist and engineer Werner von Siemens in 1866 was to change tramways forever. Magnus Vogt of Brighton's Vokes Electric Railway brought electric traction to the UK in 1883. Using a live centre rail, this was unsafe for public areas. One of the UK's great tramway pioneers, engineer Michael Holroyd Smith, inadvertently solved the issue when he created an electric children's pleasure ride.
Blackpool Council went to have a look at that and decided that's an interesting concept. Originally they were going to look at it to put in the Winter Gardens complex, but they asked Holroyd Smith could he build a bigger one that would carry lots of people up and down the seafront, and he said he was certain that he could. So they bought all his patents and he built the first passenger carrying street tramway in the British Isles in Blackpool in 1885.
On the 29th of September, the 3-mile Blackpool tramway opened.
They didn't use the overhead wire system, which is the most traditional. They used a conduit, a slot in the middle of the road, to collect the electricity. And being Blackpool, of course, it got filled with sand. So, of course, that didn't work too well.
The electric tram was born, and the age of the electric tramway had begun, albeit slowly.
Electricity was the saviour, really, of tramways, and once they developed the way of getting traction motors to work efficiently, then we started to have electric tramways taking over from the horse.
Electric trams were the height of modernity. Highly varnished with gold leaf and decorative paintwork, they moved without visible means of propulsion and were brightly lit at night.
The design of trams was very much traditional right through from the early days through to the 1930s, largely because they were all based around having a separate chassis with a body built upon it, 4 corner pillars, two floors, a staircase. There were variations in the way that the staircases could be arranged. Sometimes they were conventional, sometimes they were reversed. But they were very, very traditional in their design.
The wooden tramcars came in a variety of styles. Double-deckers, open on top and glazed below, and single-deckers, open or glazed, were the 2 basic types. The biggest leap forward for tramways came following the successful demonstration of an American overhead line system at the International Exhibition in Edinburgh in 1890. A year later, Roundhay Park Tramway in Leeds became the first public electric tram service to use overhead power lines on British streets.
It was a much more effective means of providing the power. Problem with the third rail was that if you were unlucky, people would come into contact with the third rail and potentially kill themselves. The overhead system was ideal because it was separated from the surface. It enabled much easier maintenance. It was much easier to install, much cheaper to install.
The first commercial line was the South Staffordshire line, which really took it on as being a tramway and not an experimental line. So that was really the first example of what was the great breakthrough in electric tramways in this country.
But even then again, the power sources were different. There was the conduit system in London where the power was drawn from a cable underneath the ground. There was the overhead wire system. There was the stud system, which they used in places like Wolverhampton, where the current was picked up from studs laid in the road. And unfortunately, these remained active and were electrocuting horses that were trying to walk across the track. So there were all kinds of ways of, again, trying to keep the costs down, to find what the most cost-effective way was going to be.
One amazing electrified survivor is the Manx Electric Railway, which even today provides an inter-urban tramway route serving tourists and locals on the Isle of Man. Built between 1893 and 1899, as a condition of planning for large housing development and pleasure grounds, the tramway was to be operated by animal, steam, electric or any other power. The 18-mile journey from Douglas to the northern town of Ramsey is regarded as one of the most scenic in the British Isles, hugging the coast for much of its route. As overhead lines became the predominant form of motive power for trams, electrified tramways sprang up around the country.
The great explosion in electric tramways was really between 1902 and 1904, when everybody wanted a tramway and it was the thing to have. You'd just got to have an electric tramway.
Northernmost system in the British Isles was Cruden Bay in northern Aberdeenshire. Southernmost was Guernsey in the Channel Islands. There were tramways in Cornwall, Camborne and Redruth, in Kent.
In 1899, like so many others, Blackpool converted their electric tramways to overhead pickup. The overhead line system was seen to be the way forward for trams. But even so, there were still thousands of horse trams carrying millions of passengers each year. The end for horse and steam tramways was nearing as they were swept aside by the electric revolution. The steam tram had vanished from urban streets by 1910.
The population who used the trams were wide-ranging. Increasingly, as society became more urbanised, people had further to travel to and from their work, and therefore they became very much the transport of the working classes.
Low levels of literacy meant that tram operators had to devise ways of letting their passengers know routes and destinations.
So places like Glasgow and other operators adopted what were known as route colours. In other words, they would paint a specific band of colour between the two decks, for example, which would indicate that a blue tram went to X, a yellow tram went to Y, a red tram went to Z.
The problem was that it was rather imposed a rigidity on the allocation of cars. So if you put a blue car on a white route, this was going to cause confusion. So eventually the system was done away with.
Although most authorities chose overhead lines because they were reliable, cheap to install and easier to maintain, some opted for other forms of power delivery.
There were a number of cities, capital cities, Washington, Paris, Brussels, London, that decided they didn't want unsightly overhead wires in the main central areas. So they adopted this conduit system, which was extremely expensive, but it did remove the overhead wires.
The conduit system in London used ploughs because that was the technical name for the equipment that was used to catch the electricity, and the plough was effectively a shoe that was fitted underneath the tram that was inserted into the conduit to pick the power up, and at the point at which the tram went from the overhead to the conduit system, there were what was known as change pits, and the shoe plough would come out or go under the tram. At the point the tram would stop, the plough would come out or go in, and then the tram would then move on under the other means of propulsion.
And you then had to put the trolley pole up onto the overhead wire, and these were done at these plough change points. The London conduit system, even after the war, employed about 800 men simply to keep the system functioning.
The Kingsway Tramway subway, the only underground tramway route in the UK, opened in February 1906.
London was always a problem for the tramways because the powers that be didn't want to see the trams serve the central core. But to form a link between the trams of the North London and South London, a subway was connected from effectively the Aldwych, the embankment, through to Southampton Row.
It was open first for single deckers, and then it was completely rebuilt for operation by double-deckers in the early 1930s. And it was a very, very advanced concept of taking the trams out of these busy main thoroughfares and putting them in the subway. It had 2 internal stations and was really a landmark.
Over 120 miles of London's tram routes were electrified between 1901 and 1910, creating the largest tram network in Europe. There were over 300 tramways in towns and cities throughout the UK. Nearly half of them had opened after 1900. Poor roadways and motorbuses with solid tyres offered little competition to trams, but the tram did have one early competitor, the emerging safety bicycle. Initially a hobby for the rich, the bicycle had become a very practical means of transport for workers.
The 1910s and 1920s were really the time when the trams were the main form of urban public transport.
But the golden age of the tram had no sooner arrived than war was on the horizon. The outbreak of the First World War called a halt to the expansion of tramways, as men were called up to fight for their country.
During the First World War, a number of tramway systems did actually employ women, particularly as conductors, and later some systems actually had women drivers.
Tramway drivers and conductors were looked up to largely. It was a good job. And so the tramways actually did a lot for the emancipation of women. And this was 14 years before women eventually got the vote.
The war had left the country penniless. There was no money for investment in the ageing tram infrastructure. Tramways had run-down vehicles, worn-out track and old equipment. One of the first abandonments took place when the Sheerness tramway stopped operating in 1917. But there was another unexpected competitor born of the war.
Vast numbers of surplus army lorries became available, allowed people to start to develop the coaching industry, started to compete with the tramways. There was no regulation of the road traffic industry, so you could run your pirate bus against a tram with no restriction. Inevitably they would compete with the most profitable tramway routes, and the consequence was a number of these tramways disappeared.
Now some did invest in new vehicles and others began to look at replacing the trams, and dangled in front of them were new buses that were coming on stream, and also the trolleybus. So for a short while at the beginning of the 1920s, there was a bit of which way shall we go?
The maximum number of trams in this country wasn't until 1927, it was 14,000. But the decline had already begun. At that time, it was masked by continued expansion.
In the late 1920s, the Metropolitan Electric and London United Tramways jointly designed the Feltham Tram as a response to London's ageing tramway fleet.
The Felthams were named Feltham because they were built by a company based in Feltham. They were designed as more modern trams, bigger capacity, with a separated driver's cab, which is why they had this sort of protuberance at the front. Historically, the tram driver stood on the platform at the front of the tram, and the passengers would pass the driver or the conductor as they got on and off the tram. With more modern trams, such as the Feltham, it became increasingly the case that the tram design was such that the driver was segregated from the passenger.
They really thought the thing out from scratch, so that it didn't have straight sides, the sides sloped in slightly, the ends tapered in slightly. There was a front exit as well as a rear entrance. There were straight stairs instead of curved stairs. There were a lot of fascinating features about the Feltham, which made it an attractive, competitive vehicle.
There were municipalities that saw the future with the tramway, and a number of these also invested not only in new vehicles, but they built extensions. And a number of these extensions were built on private or reserved tracks. In other words, the trams were segregated from the rest of the traffic. And this did look to be very much the future in a way for the tram, and of course, ironically, it has proved to be the future.
The reality was, though, that trams were falling out of favour with both the public and operators. By comparison, trolley buses were new, modern and comfortable.
The trolleybus was seen as an attractive alternative to the tram because it still used the power generated from the municipal power stations, and it didn't have track, it didn't have rails, it ran on the road, but it was seen really as being a very good alternative to the tram because it was cost effective and because it used locally produced power.
The remaining tramway systems had to choose between modernisation or closure. With operating and maintenance costs often exceeding revenue, smaller systems had no option other than to close.
There were political pressures as well, and politicians tended to, I think, follow fads. The fad became to get rid of the trams. That became very, very fashionable, and very often they didn't perhaps consider whether retaining them would actually have been better for the people they were serving. I think one thing that the public always loved was the illuminated tram, the tram at night bedecked with hundreds of coloured lights. But Blackpool, of course, became the epitome for the illuminated tram, which came in the 1920s. You see this mass of coloured lights coming towards you, and people stop. Now, there's very few instances where you do this now. Life is so fast, all goes by so quickly, but nearly everybody stops when the illuminated tram goes by.
Blackpool was fairly unique in that not only did it decorate tramcars for special occasions, but by 1925 it had started to construct something quite unique in the world, the heritage feature class of tram.
The original illuminated trams were replaced from 1959 onwards. 3 of these still run as part of the Illuminations tours. However, finding the funding to preserve and maintain these heritage trams can be difficult. Withdrawn from service in 1999, the illuminated Western train that was built in 1962 on the frame of 2 much older tramcars was in dire need of care by 2006.
We actually put in a heritage lottery bid for that, the first time a commercial company had ever received lottery funding for a project of this nature. It cost over £370,000 to actually complete the vehicle. It's probably the most difficult, complex and expensive restoration that we'd ever challenged ourselves with, quite frankly.
When we got into the 30s, of course, there was the Depression, so that was another big problem. And of course, that meant that revenue reduced because people hadn't got so much spending power.
A Royal Commission had declared tramways, if not obsolete, certainly obsolescent. 30 years old, worn out and in urgent need of modernisation, with declining passenger numbers and no government money to invest, the first big phase of tramway closures took place. As early as 1935, London's tramways were being replaced.
There was a realisation if trams were going to survive, then they had to make and find more modern designs.
There were a lot of new designs, but a lot of them were what I would call cosmetic. It was streamlining, it was presentation, it was details. There weren't all that many things which made a big contribution to the either the revenue they brought in or the costs involved in running them.
At the forefront of the new designs was Blackpool.
In Blackpool during the 1930s, Walter Luff was heavily involved in the modernisation of the Blackpool tram fleet. The management at Blackpool's trams constructed a whole range of both double and single deck trams in a very stylish, streamlined form.
And this was a revolutionary design with a centre door, with bogies, with fluorescent lighting. The whole thing had a much more modern appearance, an Art Deco appearance in fact. And there was then a double-decker version of it, which were the balloon double-deckers, very high capacity.
The English electric company's balloon tram entered service in late 1934. They became known as balloon cars because of their rounded shape and the hissing of air escaping from their air brakes. The balloon was so robust that the trams formed the backbone of the Blackpool fleet until the tramway's conversion to a modern light railway network in 2012.
London introduced one new tram. It had the Feltham Trams in the 1920s, but it introduced another new tram, LCC number 1, which was called the Bluebird because of the livery.
LCC-1 was a 1932 prototype built in response to the threat from both rival London tramways and new motorbuses. LCC-1 became an influential design with its blend of old and modern.
So from the 30s onwards was the real development of the trams, but unfortunately it was government policy by then that tramway systems had got to close.
Even with modernisation, the number of British trams in operation halved, and influential reports into traffic in towns and cities cited the tram as a problem and condemned them.
The LRTL, or Light Railway Transport League, was a pressure group established in 1937 with a view to promoting tramway development. They were battling against the fashion of the period, inasmuch as most major towns and cities by that stage had either abandoned trams or were looking towards an abandonment policy.
All too soon, the Second World War arrived, and the phrase "make do and mend" most certainly applied to the tram systems. The First World War might have speeded the end for some tramways, but the Second World War prolonged the life for others. The country didn't produce its own oil to fuel buses, but it did produce coal to fire power stations, so electric trams were an advantage.
The government policy then was, because of fuel shortages, as you had electric tramway, you had to keep it and you weren't allowed to close it.
At the start of the war, in 1939, 8,000 trams were still in use, and women were once again recruited to operate trams.
The condition that the infrastructure was in 1945 was a telling point. It was particularly true in a place like Liverpool, where the tramway system, because of the severe bombing, and in Glasgow and Clydebank in 1941, a lot of the infrastructure was in bad condition. Now, some places it was restored, but the feeling was that the trams had had their day. At the end of the war, there were about 6,000 trams, some of them in appalling condition. People say that the trams in Salford and Bolton were in such a terrible state that the whole thing was literally falling apart.
Better road surfaces, diesel motorbuses and trolleybuses with comfortable padded seats and pneumatic tyres provided a far more comfortable public transport option. Post-war, new lighter industries were not built on existing tramway routes. workers could no longer rely on the tramways to take them to and from work. Buses and personal cars provided greater flexibility as housing developments extended further out of the city centres. The transport needs of the population had changed, and existing tramways did not offer the solution.
There were exceptions, for example. Liverpool was investing heavily in modern trams and tramway extensions. Quite often it could come down to the role of a single individual. Leeds, for example, had a programme of planned tramway subways and in fact built 3 experimental single-deck trams with a view to operating them on the subways. One individual Labour politician came out against the trams, managed to convince the local Labour Party that trams were old-fashioned and therefore inappropriate to a modern city. And when the Labour Party came to power, his influence was such that a once vibrant tramway system went from modernisation to abandonment in the space of 6 years. By and large, the tramway was in decline across the UK.
The bus offered a greater alternative for public transport as the brave new world and people were going for buses, and private car ownership of course came on, and so really the tram was looked to be part of the old world.
There was a very big lobby in saying that the tram got in the way in the street. It was blamed for all that problem, and yet when the trams went, did the traffic congestion go? No, in fact, if anything, it got worse.
The LRTL organised special farewell tours of closing tramways.
In 1948, they hired a Southampton tram, and it happened to be a very fine day, and they visited a depot where there were a lot of the old open-top trams, which had already been withdrawn from service. And they said, wouldn't it be nice if we could have one of these? The question was asked, can we buy one of these? And the answer came back, yes, £10. And I was then aged 14, and I gave £half a crown to this fund, 12.5 pence in today's money, thus became unwittingly one of the founders of the tramway preservation movement.
Southampton 45 was the first tram to enter preservation.
Where to put a tram when you've got it is a big, big problem, because you can't put them in your garage. You've got a vehicle that may weigh anything from 10 tons to 20 tons, and anything up to 32 feet long and 16 feet high. You've got to put it somewhere.
They were collecting more and more trams, and it was quite clear that they needed a site to put them on.
But in January 1949, Manchester became the first large city to close its tramways, changing inevitably to buses and trolleybuses. London trams were to face the same fate soon afterwards. Operation Tramaway was announced in July 1950. The city's first-generation tramway network was eliminated in less than 2 years.
Lord Ashfield, at the end of the London's trams, stood up and said, "Goodbye, old tram." That was very much the attitude of mind at the time. The tramway was outdated. A modern city didn't require trams. The bus was the way ahead, flexible, cheap, more comfortable, bigger passenger capacity.
Trams were being scrapped and burnt across the country.
The Crich Tramway Museum dates back to the mid-1950s, when the Light Railway Transport League established what was known as its museum committee, with a view to trying to identify trams that merited preservation.
Right from the start, we wanted to build a tramway that was operational, so that people could experience riding on the tram rather than just see it in a shed somewhere.
We'd been searching for a museum site for a long time. Crich came about because the mineral railway there, which served the quarry, was being lifted. The rails were going to the Talyllyn Railway.
The Tramway Museum Society moved into the former quarry at Crich in 1959.
The collection now is recognised as the national collection for tramways, and so we were given the title designated collections, and the government department recognised that these were the place to come for tramway history, and it is also internationally recognised, and we have anything to do with trams and tramway history.
And a bit like the historic tramways, started off by operating a horse tram, experimented with a steam tram, and then operated electric trams.
Even popular tourist tramways faced closure. The Llandudno and Colwyn Bay Tramway, a 3'6" narrow gauge electric tramway, operated between the two North Wales seaside resorts. Despite intense competition from Crossville buses, more than 2.5 million passengers were carried annually. However, the company claimed that operational costs were becoming too expensive, forcing the last narrow gauge tramway to close in 1956. The 1960s was to be the final decade of first-generation trams on the streets of Britain. Sheffield was the last public tramway in England to close in 1960. But special tram services such as the Grimsby and Immingham Tramway also faced the axe.
Grimsby and Immingham was one of a handful of tramways built by pre-grouping railway companies. The Great Central built enormous docks at Immingham, and to get the workforce to and from the docks, they built an electric tramway, the Grimsby and Immingham, which was the only electric tramway to be nationalised in 1948. The Grimsby and Immingham became part of British Rail and were to survive and to become the last total conversion to bus operation in Great Britain, because they survived until 1961.
Glasgow in 1962 brought an end to British urban mass transport systems. The only survivors after Glasgow closed were Blackpool and the Isle of Man.
For enthusiasts, the rundown and the scrapping of the trams was actually quite painful, because we thought that these policies were wrong and that some of these tram systems should have survived and actually would have been beneficial for the communities that they served. But there was also an emotional side to it, because it was like saying goodbye to very old friends.
What it felt like was a series of funerals. It was like seeing a whole lot of old friends die off. And I seemed to spend a lot of my time going to, let's go to Blackburn for the last time, or let's go to Bradford for the last time.
Rapidly increasing oil costs in the 1970s called for well-planned public transport services which reduced reliance upon oil. Electric trams appeared to be the ideal solution. And as environmental concerns and road congestion grew, attitudes towards tramways changed.
There are now people talking with enthusiasm about trams who never remember the old generation. The people who scrapped the old generation have retired, died. It's a new generation of people, and they aren't burdened with the bad things of history.
The second generation of street-running trams are often articulated single-deckers which are fast, efficient and suited to their role. The Manchester Metrolink opened in April 1992. Metrolink trams run on-street in Manchester city centre. And most of the routes in the suburbs use former heavy rail lines, which are segregated from street traffic. Nearly 50 years after the closure of the original first-generation tramways, London's first all-new system opened to the public in May 2000. But in a nod to tradition, their numbering starts from where London's original tramways left off, 2530.
London Tramlink is a tram system that runs in South London. It's 28 kilometres long, it includes 39 stops, it centres around the hub, which is actually in central Croydon, but goes out to Wimbledon, Beckenham, Elmer's End and New Addington.
Croydon itself is actually a really big urban centre. On its own, if it wasn't sort of within London, people would think of it as a major town or city. When you get an urban area that big, you generally need to move from road-based forms of transport to rail to move the numbers of people, move them efficiently, move them safely and quickly. In somewhere like Croydon, a really built-up historic, in parts, town centre, you need to operate through the streets, and for that you do trams. So it's finding the appropriate mode, and for Croydon, trams are really where it's at. In terms of reintroducing trams to London, it's really about sort of starting a pipeline again. We knew how to do something years ago, we then had to relearn it in Britain in terms of introducing the new generation of tram systems all around the country. So Croydon was the same issues as that.
On the Wimbledon branch, it's old railway line that's been converted to tramway. Around the town centre, it's all runs within the highway. Towards New Addington, it runs initially on old railway line, and then it's new segregated lines out into the countryside. The system itself runs on a line of sight, generally, just like you do in your car. On the single line sections, it is slightly different in the fact that it is run from the control room.
Recent investment in the Croydon system has seen capacity improvements and the introduction of a fourth route to supplement the original three. The line's permanent weight, such as track, signalling and overhead lines, are also being upgraded to increase services.
Tram system is absolutely huge success. It's a joy to be in charge of it. It's got the highest customer satisfaction of pretty well any mode within TfL's family. We measure customer satisfaction across, and people love trams more than, dare I say, almost anything else. And it's something that people only ever want more of.
Nottingham Express Transit opened in 2004. A light rail transit system constructed along former railway lines with some street-running tramways. The NET attracts 10 million passengers each year. Through major investment, Nottingham's tramline is being developed into a city-wide network over entirely newly constructed routes. After more than 125 years of regular operation, one of the most recent modern tramways has been constructed in the home of Britain's first electric tramway, Blackpool.
The tram network on the whole of the vehicles and everything else had been operating for something like 125 years. Yes, there'd obviously been some investment in the past, but it was getting tired. So it needed to be upgraded.
Had we not upgraded the tramway, then our system would have closed down because the older trams would have become entirely illegal.
The system would have either had to operate as a heritage tramway, something like Crich, but albeit on the promenade, or a decision had to be made to totally upgrade it and make it into a modern LRT system.
In April 2012, Blackpool started operating Flexity 2 LRT trams on the £110 million tramway. Once the domain of tourists, Blackpool's modern trams are serving locals too. In England, there were 204 million passenger journeys made on light rail systems in 2011-12. With more electric tramway networks developing in the UK, tramways appear to have a bright future.
The future of the tram in the UK is, I think, very positive. Clearly, the pressures that led to the development of the second generation tramways in places like Manchester and Nottingham are not going to go away. There are concerns about pollution in urban areas. There are still issues of congestion. There is still the need for people to get from point A to point B quickly, efficiently and cheaply. And the tramway, or light rapid transit, represents a very sensible means of doing so.